The last man to see all 27 members of the Harlan County Mining Consortium alive was a bartender named Cecil Pruitt, who watched them ride past his saloon at approximately 7:30 in the evening on October 14, 1878. They were heading toward the Whitmore property, a sprawling tract of land in the hills of eastern Kentucky that the consortium had been trying to acquire through legal pressure and not-so-legal intimidation for the better part of 2 years. Cecil would later tell investigators that the men seemed confident, almost jovial, laughing among themselves as their horses kicked up dust on the narrow mountain road. They carried rifles and sidearms, enough firepower to start a small war, and they rode with the casual arrogance of men who believed their numbers and their weapons made them invincible. None of them were ever seen again. What happened on the Whitmore property that night has never been fully explained. The official investigation, conducted by a sheriff who owed significant gambling debts to members of the consortium, concluded that the 27 men had likely been ambushed by bandits and their bodies disposed of in one of the countless abandoned mine shafts that dotted the region. This explanation satisfied no one who knew the area, the Whitmore family, or the true nature of the conflict that had been building for years. But it was the official story, and in the absence of bodies, witnesses, or any physical evidence of what had occurred, it remained the only story. The truth, passed down through generations in whispers and half-remembered accounts, was far darker. The Whitmore family, insulted beyond endurance by what had happened inside their church 3 days before the disappearance, had exacted a vengeance so complete that it erased 27 men from existence as thoroughly as if they had never been born. If you believe that some families carry grudges that transcend generations and consequences, subscribe now and hit that notification bell. And leave me a comment telling me what city you're watching from, because I want to know where the people come from who appreciate the stories nobody else dares to tell. Harlan County, Kentucky, 1878. The mountains that dominated the landscape were ancient beyond human comprehension, worn smooth by millions of years of rain and wind into rolling green waves that seemed to stretch forever in every direction. The hollows between those mountains, narrow valleys carved by streams that had been flowing since before humans walked the earth, were home to families who had lived there for generations, who knew every rock and tree and hidden path as intimately as they knew their own bodies. These were people whose ancestors had crossed the mountains from Virginia and North Carolina before the Revolution. Scots-Irish settlers who brought with them a culture that valued family above all else, and held grudges with a persistence that outsiders found difficult to comprehend. The Whitmore family had arrived in what would become Harlan County in 1789, when Josiah Whitmore led his wife, 7 children, and 3 brothers' families over the Cumberland Gap, and into the wilderness that would become their home. They claimed a hollow that had no name and gave it one. Whitmore Hollow, a designation that would appear on maps for the next century and beyond. The land they claimed was rich in timber, well-watered and defensible, with narrow approaches that could be watched and controlled by a small number of determined men. It was, in short, the perfect place for a family that trusted no one outside their own blood. By 1878, the Whitmore family had grown to include nearly 60 people spread across a dozen households, all clustered within the hollow that bore their name. They were farmers primarily, scratching a living from the thin mountain soil, supplementing their crops with hunting and small-scale timber operations. They were not wealthy by any external measure, but they owned their land free and clear, owed nothing to anyone, and maintained a fierce independence that set them apart from many of their neighbors who had fallen into debt and dependency. The patriarch of the family in 1878 was Ezekiel Whitmore, a man of 63 years who had survived the Civil War, 3 blood feuds with neighboring families, and the deaths of 2 wives and 4 children. Ezekiel was not a large man physically, but he carried himself with an authority that made larger men step aside when he passed. His eyes, a pale blue that seemed to see through any deception, had witnessed things that he never discussed, but that had carved deep lines into a face that rarely smiled. He led the Whitmore family with absolute authority, his word law within the hollow, his decisions questioned by no one who wished to remain part of the clan. Ezekiel had 7 surviving sons, ranging in age from 42 to 26, and each of those sons had sons of their own. The Whitmore men were known throughout the county for their skill with firearms, their willingness to use violence when they deemed it necessary, and their unshakable loyalty to one another. Cross one Whitmore, the local wisdom held, and you cross them all. Harm one, and you would answer to every man, woman, and child who bore the name. This reputation had kept the family safe through decades of the casual violence that characterized life in the Kentucky mountains, deterring would-be enemies who calculated that the cost of confrontation outweighed any potential benefit. The trouble with the Harlan County Mining Consortium began in 1876, when geologists working for Eastern investors discovered significant coal deposits in the mountains surrounding Whitmore Hollow. Coal was transforming the economy of Appalachia, bringing railroads and money and outside influence into regions that had existed in isolation for generations. Fortunes were being made by those who owned the mineral rights to the land beneath which the black gold lay buried, and fortunes were being taken from those who could be convinced or coerced into selling those rights for fractions of their true value. The consortium was a partnership of 7 men, all from outside the region, who had pooled their resources to acquire mineral rights throughout Harlan County. Their methods varied depending on the target. Some landowners were simply bought out with cash offers that seemed generous to people who had never seen large sums of money. Others were pressured through legal mechanisms, their land titles challenged on technicalities that required expensive lawyers to fight. And others, those who proved resistant to both approaches, found themselves facing difficulties that seemed to come from nowhere. Barns that burned in the night, livestock that disappeared, accidents that befell family members who strayed too far from home. The Whitmore family was targeted because their hollow sat directly above one of the richest coal seams the geologists had identified. The consortium's initial approach was straightforward. They offered Ezekiel Whitmore $12,000 for the mineral rights to his family's land, a sum that would have made him wealthy by local standards. Ezekiel refused without negotiation, explaining in terms that left no room for misunderstanding that the land had been Whitmore land for nearly 90 years and would remain Whitmore land until the mountains themselves crumbled to dust. The consortium did not accept this refusal gracefully. Over the following 18 months, the Whitmore family experienced a series of misfortunes that Ezekiel quickly recognized as manufactured rather than natural. A barn burned, taking with it the winter hay supply. Several head of cattle were found dead from poison. A lawsuit appeared challenging the validity of the original Whitmore land grant, requiring money the family didn't have to hire lawyers they didn't trust. And in the spring of 1878, Ezekiel's youngest son, Thomas, was shot from ambush while hunting on family land. He survived, but the bullet had shattered his right arm so badly that it had to be amputated, leaving a 26-year-old man crippled for life. The shooter was never identified, but the Whitmore family had no doubt about who was responsible. They had seen the pattern, understood the escalation, recognized the consortium's strategy of applying pressure until resistance seemed more costly than surrender. What the consortium failed to understand was that they were not dealing with ordinary mountain farmers. They were dealing with Whitmores, and Whitmores did not surrender. They got even. Ezekiel's response to the shooting of his son was not immediate, which the consortium interpreted as weakness. In fact, it was calculation. Ezekiel knew that any retaliation had to be complete enough to eliminate the threat permanently. Wounding the consortium, killing 1 or 2 of its members, would only provoke escalation. The outside money behind these men could hire more guns, apply more pressure, wage a war of attrition that the Whitmore family could not win through conventional means. No, what was required was something different. Something so devastating that it would not only destroy the consortium, but serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider similar aggression against the family. The planning took months. Ezekiel consulted with his sons and with elder members of the family, developing an understanding of the consortium's structure, its members, its patterns of movement and behavior. They identified the key figures, the 7 partners who had formed the consortium, plus the managers, lawyers, enforcers, and hired guns who made their operations possible. 27 men in total who were directly involved in the campaign against the Whitmore family. 27 men who would need to be dealt with if the threat was to be eliminated permanently. The opportunity presented itself in October 1878, created by the consortium's own arrogance. The Whitmores, like most families in the region, attended church regularly, gathering each Sunday at a small Baptist chapel that sat at the edge of their hollow where the road connected to the wider world. The chapel had been built by Josiah Whitmore himself, its hand-hewn logs now weathered by nearly 90 years of Kentucky seasons, and it served not only as a place of worship, but as a community gathering point where news was shared, disputes were mediated, and the bonds of family were reinforced. It was sacred ground to the Whitmores, perhaps the most sacred ground outside of the cemetery where their ancestors lay buried. On Sunday, October 11, 1878, The consortium made its final mistake. The 7 partners, accompanied by a dozen of their most trusted men, rode into the church service uninvited and unannounced. They came armed, their horses' hooves announcing their arrival during the middle of the sermon. The congregation fell silent as the men entered, their boots loud on the wooden floor, their presence a violation of everything the space represented. They positioned themselves around the interior of the chapel, blocking the doors, their weapons visible and ready. The leader of the consortium, a man named Harrison Caldwell who had made his fortune in railroad speculation before turning to mineral rights, walked to the front of the church and interrupted the preacher mid-sentence. What he said to the gathered Whitmores was witnessed by over 40 people, and would be repeated for generations afterward. "I want you all to look around this chapel," Caldwell said, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. "Take a good look, because this is the last time you'll see it standing. We've tried being reasonable with you people, tried offering you fair compensation for what we need, but you've chosen to be difficult, so now we're done being reasonable." He walked closer to where Ezekiel Whitmore sat in the front pew, his wife beside him, his sons arranged in the rows behind. "Here's what's going to happen, old man. You're going to sign over the mineral rights to your land by the end of this month. The price we're offering has dropped to $2,000, and that's more than you deserve. If you refuse, we're going to burn this church. Then we're going to burn every house in this hollow. Then we're going to start on the people, starting with that crippled boy of yours." Caldwell leaned closer, close enough that Ezekiel could smell the tobacco on his breath. "And there's not a goddamn thing you or your inbred family can do about it. We have the law, we have the money, and we have more guns than you can count. You're nothing but dirt farmers who've outlived your usefulness. Sign the papers, take the money, and crawl off somewhere to die. That's the best future any of you can hope for now." He spat on the floor at Ezekiel's feet, then turned and walked out of the church, his men following. The last one out slammed the door so hard that dust fell from the rafters. The congregation sat in stunned silence for a long moment after the consortium's men departed. The preacher, a man named Reverend Hoskins who was not a Whitmore by blood, but who had served the community for 20 years, looked at Ezekiel with an expression that mixed outrage with fear. He knew, as everyone present knew, that what had just occurred was not merely an insult, but a declaration of war. The question was how the Whitmores would respond. Ezekiel rose slowly from his pew, his joints stiff with age, but his bearing as straight as it had been in his youth. He looked around the chapel, meeting the eyes of every family member present, seeing in each face the same cold rage that burned in his own heart. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the small building. "They came into our church. They threatened our women and children. They spat on sacred ground." He paused, letting the words settle. "There's only one answer to such an insult. Every man who was part of that today dies. Every one of them." No one disagreed. No one suggested negotiation or restraint or any response other than the one Ezekiel had pronounced. The consortium had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, violated a sanctuary that could not be violated without consequence. By their own actions, they had written their death sentences. The planning accelerated over the next 3 days. Scouts were sent to observe the consortium's movements, to identify where each of the 27 men could be found on any given night, to map their routines and vulnerabilities. The women of the family prepared supplies, knowing without being told that their men would be gone for extended periods and might return wounded. The older boys, some as young as 14, were given assignments that would keep them away from the direct violence while still contributing to the family's effort. October 14th was chosen for the action, because intelligence indicated that the consortium was planning a show of force against the Whitmore property that night. All 27 of the targeted men would be riding together, heading toward the hollow with the intention of burning the church as Caldwell had promised. This actually made the Whitmores' task easier. Instead of hunting their enemies across the county, they could simply prepare the ground and let their enemies come to them. The hollow had been defended before. During the Civil War, a company of Union foragers had attempted to enter Whitmore land seeking supplies, and they had been repulsed with casualties by a fraction of the men now available. The narrow approaches, the dense forest, the intimate knowledge of every rock and tree. All these gave defenders an advantage that attackers could only overcome through overwhelming numbers or patience that the consortium did not possess. What the Whitmores prepared that night was not a battle, but an execution. They did not seek victory in any conventional sense. They sought annihilation. The road into Whitmore Hollow followed the course of a creek that had been carving its path through the mountains since before humans existed. It was narrow, barely wide enough for two horses to ride abreast, and it wound through terrain that alternated between dense forest and exposed rock faces that rose like walls on either side. For most of its length, the road was overlooked by high ground that offered perfect positions for anyone who wished to observe travelers without being observed themselves. It was, in short, a death trap for anyone foolish enough to enter without permission. The Whitmore men had been in position since late afternoon, scattered along the 2-mile stretch of road that led from the main county route to the entrance of the hollow proper. There were 31 of them in total, ranging from Ezekiel's eldest son Jeremiah, who was 42 and had killed his first man during the war, to young Daniel Whitmore, who was 14 and had never fired at anything more threatening than a deer. Each man knew his position, his field of fire, and his role in what was about to unfold. They had rehearsed their movements in their minds, walked the ground during daylight hours, prepared themselves for violence that would be absolute and unforgiving. Ezekiel himself waited at the narrowest point of the road, a place where the creek made a sharp bend, and the path was squeezed between a sheer rock face on one side and a steep drop to the water on the other. This was where the killing would begin, where the first shots would be fired, where the consortium's column would be split and thrown into chaos before they could organize any coherent response. The old man held his rifle with the ease of someone who had been carrying weapons for most of his 63 years, and his pale eyes watched the darkness with a patience that only age and experience could provide. The sound of approaching horses reached them before the riders came into view, hooves on packed earth and the jingle of tack carrying clearly through the still night air. Ezekiel counted the sounds, estimating numbers, confirming what his scouts had reported. All 27 were coming, just as anticipated. The consortium had gathered their full strength for this show of force, never suspecting that their full strength would be entirely insufficient for what awaited them. The first riders appeared around a bend in the road, their forms visible as darker shadows against the darkness of the forest behind them. They rode casually, their weapons holstered or slung across their backs, exhibiting the carelessness of men who did not expect resistance. Harrison Caldwell was near the front, recognizable by the white hat he habitually wore, a vanity that made him an easy target in the darkness. Ezekiel let the column advance until approximately half of the riders had passed his position. Then he raised his rifle, sighted on Caldwell's chest, and fired. The shot shattered the night's silence with a thunderclap that echoed off the rock walls. Caldwell was thrown backward from his saddle, dead before he hit the ground, and in the instant of shock that followed, every other Whitmore along the road opened fire simultaneously. The effect was devastating. Men and horses screamed as bullets found flesh. Riders tumbled from their mounts. Those who tried to return fire aimed at muzzle flashes and hit nothing, their shots passing harmlessly into the darkness where Whitmore's had already shifted to secondary positions. The training that several consortium men had received, their experience in violent confrontations, might have served them in a fair fight. This was not a fair fight. This was an ambush executed with precision by men who knew every feature of the terrain, who could reload and fire faster than their targets could identify where the shots were coming from. The consortium's advantages in numbers and firepower were meaningless when they couldn't see their enemies and couldn't find cover on the narrow road. The initial volley killed or wounded nearly half the consortium's force. The survivors attempted to flee in both directions, some spurring their horses forward toward the hollow, others wheeling around to retreat the way they had come. Neither option offered salvation. The Whitmores had positioned men to cover both directions of escape, and each attempt to break out of the kill zone was met with concentrated fire that cut down men and horses alike. The fighting, if it could be called that, lasted less than 15 minutes. When the last gunshots faded into echoes and the last screams died away, 23 of the 27 consortium members lay dead or dying on the road. Their horses, those that hadn't been killed in the crossfire, had fled into the darkness, some of them carrying wounded riders who wouldn't get far. Ezekiel descended from his position to survey the carnage, carrying a lantern that cast flickering light across a scene that would have horrified anyone not hardened by years of mountain violence. Bodies lay scattered across a quarter-mile of road, some face down in the creek, others sprawled across the rocks, a few still tangled in stirrups and being dragged by panicked horses that hadn't run far enough to escape the hollow's confines. The air smelled of gunpowder and blood, and the particular odor of death that those who had experienced it never forgot. "Count them," Ezekiel ordered. "Make sure we got them all." The counting took time. complicated by the darkness and the condition of some bodies. When his sons reported the tally, Ezekiel's expression didn't change, but those who knew him recognized the slight tightening of his jaw that indicated displeasure. 23 confirmed dead. 4 unaccounted for. 4 had escaped, at least initially. This was not acceptable. The Whitmores had planned for absolute elimination, and 4 survivors meant 4 potential witnesses, 4 possible sources of testimony that could bring the law down on the family. Ezekiel issued orders immediately, sending his fastest riders to track the escapees, to find them before they could reach safety and report what had happened. The pursuit lasted through the night and into the following morning. 2 of the fleeing men were found within 3 miles of the ambush site, their horses having thrown them or collapsed from wounds. They were finished quickly, their bodies added to the count. A third was tracked to a farmhouse where he had sought refuge, and the farmer, recognizing the Whitmore riders and understanding the situation, handed over his guest without protest. The man died in the woods before he could speak a word of pleading. The 4th man, a consortium enforcer named Patrick Doyle, who had survived the war and numerous violent encounters since, proved more difficult. He was a skilled horseman on a fresh horse, and he had gained significant distance before the pursuit was organized. By dawn, he had crossed out of Harlan County entirely, heading west toward communities where the Whitmore name carried no weight. But the Whitmores had resources beyond their immediate hollow. Kinship networks extended throughout eastern Kentucky, families connected by blood and marriage who shared the Whitmore values and would honor requests for assistance. Messages were sent, descriptions were provided, and the informal network of mountain justice was activated. Patrick Doyle was found 6 days later in a boarding house in a town nearly 50 miles from the ambush site. He had believed himself safe, had begun to relax, had even started composing a letter to authorities describing what he had witnessed. The 2 men who found him were cousins of the Whitmores by marriage, men who had never met Doyle before that night, but who understood their obligation to family. They waited until he left the boarding house for supper, followed him into an alley, and killed him with knives to avoid the noise of gunfire. His body was weighted with stones and dropped into a river, where it was never recovered. 27 men, all accounted for, all eliminated. The disposal of the bodies presented a logistical challenge that Ezekiel had planned for in advance. Leaving them on the road was impossible, as discovery would invite investigation regardless of how unlikely witnesses might be to cooperate. Burial in marked graves would create evidence that could be found and exhumed. The bodies needed to disappear completely, as thoroughly as if the men had never existed. The solution was the mountains themselves. Throughout the region, abandoned mine shafts dotted the landscape, remnants of earlier prospecting efforts that had been abandoned when they failed to produce worthwhile yields. These shafts ranged from shallow exploratory digs to deep vertical drops that plunged hundreds of feet into the earth. The Whitmores knew the location of every such shaft on their property and on the adjacent lands, had mapped them years ago as part of understanding their territory. The bodies were loaded onto carts and transported to 3 separate locations, distributed to prevent any single discovery from revealing the full scope of what had occurred. Each shaft was deep, each was remote, each was filled with enough rock and debris after the bodies were deposited to make excavation virtually impossible with the technology of the era. The horses were dealt with similarly, their distinctive tack and brands destroyed, their remains scattered across multiple sites. By the time the sun rose on October 15th, there was no physical evidence that 27 men had died in Whitmore Hollow. The road had been raked and smoothed, the blood-soaked earth covered with fresh dirt, the shell casings collected and melted down. The families of the dead would eventually notice their absence, but they would find no answers to their questions. The Whitmore family would express ignorance of the men's whereabouts, would suggest that perhaps they had encountered bandits, would shrug with the indifference of people who had no reason to care about the fate of outsiders. The investigation that eventually followed was perfunctory at best. Sheriff Coleman, whose gambling debts had made him sympathetic to the consortium's interests while they lived, found himself suddenly free of those debts and remarkably uninterested in probing too deeply into their disappearance. The theory of bandit attack was advanced, accepted, and filed away. The families of the deceased, most of whom lived far from Harlan County and had no understanding of mountain justice, were left to draw their own conclusions. Some of them suspected the truth, of course. The timing was too convenient, the disappearance too complete. The Whitmores' continued prosperity too pointed to be coincidental. But suspicion without evidence was merely speculation, and the evidence had been scattered across a dozen abandoned mine shafts, where it would lie undisturbed until the mountains themselves eroded to dust. The Whitmore family emerged from the massacre stronger than they had been before. Their willingness to respond to threats with overwhelming and absolute violence became legendary throughout the region. A cautionary tale that discouraged future aggressors more effectively than any legal protection could have. The coal beneath their land remained untouched for decades, and when mining eventually came to Whitmore Hollow, it came on terms that the family themselves negotiated, with royalties that made them wealthy beyond what Ezekiel's generation had ever imagined. But the story of that October night took on dimensions beyond simple family legend. It became part of the folklore of the Kentucky mountains, passed down through generations in different versions that varied in detail, but agreed on the essential truth. The Whitmore family had made 27 men disappear in a single night, and they had done it so completely that the world would never know exactly what happened to them. The church where Harrison Caldwell had delivered his fatal insult remained standing for another 80 years, finally succumbing to fire in 1958, under circumstances that were officially ruled accidental. By then, few remembered its significance. Few connected the weathered building to the events of October 1878. But older members of the Whitmore family knew, and they made sure the story was passed to younger generations, a reminder of what the family was capable of when pushed beyond the limits of tolerance. Ezekiel Whitmore lived another 11 years after the massacre, dying peacefully in his bed in 1889 at the age of 74. His obituary in the county newspaper described him as a respected farmer and patriarch who had contributed greatly to the development of the region. No mention was made of his role in eliminating the Harlan County Mining Consortium, nor would any public record ever acknowledge what he had organized and overseen. His grave, in the family cemetery that had received Whitmore's since Josiah's time, bore only his name, his dates, and a simple epitaph. He protected his own. His sons and grandsons maintained the family's position in the decades that followed, navigating the changing world with the same combination of fierce independence and calculated violence that had characterized their ancestors. When the Great Labor Wars came to the Kentucky coalfields in the early 20th century, the Whitmores were among the few families who avoided the worst of the violence, their reputation serving as a shield that union organizers and company thugs alike recognized and respected. The mine shafts where the bodies had been deposited remained undisturbed through the years. Occasionally, someone would rediscover one of the locations, and there would be brief speculation about what might lie at the bottom, but no excavation was ever undertaken. The shafts were dangerous, their walls unstable, their depths unknown. Professional miners knew better than to explore such hazards, and amateur adventurers were discouraged by the Whitmores' continued presence on the land, by the understanding that some secrets were best left buried. In 1923, 45 years after the massacre, a journalist named William Hartley attempted to research the disappearance of the Harlan County Mining Consortium for a book about unsolved mysteries of Appalachia. He spent 3 weeks in the region, interviewing older residents, examining whatever records had survived, trying to piece together what had happened on that October night. His investigation brought him eventually to Whitmore Hollow, where he requested permission to speak with family members about events that had occurred before most of them were born. Ezekiel's grandson, a man named Tobias Whitmore, who was then 62 years old and the current patriarch of the family, received Hartley with courtesy that stopped just short of warmth. He listened to the journalist's questions, nodded thoughtfully at the theories advanced, and responded with answers that were technically truthful while revealing nothing. Yes, there had been a dispute with some mining speculators decades ago. Yes, those men had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. No, the family had no knowledge of what had happened to them. Perhaps they had encountered misfortune on the mountain roads, which had always been dangerous. Perhaps they had made enemies elsewhere who caught up with them. The mountains kept many secrets, and this was apparently one of them. Hartley pressed harder, pointing out the timing, the completeness of the disappearance, the fact that the Whitmores had benefited most directly from the consortium's elimination. Tobias listened patiently, then leaned forward with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Hartley, let me give you some advice. Free of charge, which is more than most advice is worth. The past is past. The men you're asking about have been dead for 45 years, if they are dead at all. Nothing you write about them will bring them back or change what happened. But writing certain things, making certain accusations without proof, that could make your own future considerably more complicated. The mountains have long memories, sir. Very long memories indeed." Hartley's book was never published. His notes disappeared from his possession during the train ride back to New York, stolen while he slept in his private compartment. He made no attempt to recreate them, and when asked about his Appalachian research in later years, he changed the subject with obvious discomfort. He died in 1947 without ever returning to Kentucky. The truth of what happened that night existed in fragments, pieces of the story held by different members of the Whitmore family and shared only under specific circumstances. The full account, as complete as memory could preserve it, was passed from each patriarch to his chosen successor. A secret inheritance more valuable than land or money, it served as a reminder of what the family had been capable of, what they might be capable of again if circumstances required, and as a warning to future generations about the costs and consequences of the kind of action their ancestors had taken. For the bodies remained where they had been placed, moldering in darkness hundreds of feet below the surface of the earth. 27 men who had believed their money and guns made them powerful, who had walked into a church and threatened people they considered beneath them, who had learned too late that the quiet farmers of the Kentucky mountains were not the easy targets they had assumed. The coal that lay beneath Whitmore Hollow was eventually extracted, but not until the 1940s, when agreements were reached that satisfied the family's demands for control and compensation. By then, the mining technology had changed. The specific locations where the bodies had been deposited were not directly affected by extraction operations, and the secret remained buried. Workers occasionally reported strange feelings in certain areas of the mines, a sense of being watched, an inexplicable coldness that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. These reports were dismissed as superstition, the natural unease of men working in dangerous darkness. But older Whitmores who heard the stories smiled and said nothing. In 1978, exactly 100 years after the massacre, the Whitmore family held a private gathering in the hollow to mark the anniversary. It was not a celebration exactly, but rather a commemoration, a recognition of an event that had shaped the family's identity and secured its position for generations. The patriarch at that time, a great-great-grandson of Ezekiel named Robert Whitmore, read aloud from a handwritten account of the events that had been preserved and passed down through the century. Many of those present were hearing the full story for the first time, and their reactions ranged from shock to pride to something more complicated that combined both. "Our ancestors did what they had to do," Robert said in conclusion. "They were threatened in their own church, their sacred ground was desecrated, and they responded in the only way that would guarantee their survival. We are here today because of what they did that night. Every Whitmore who has been born in the past 100 years exists because those men made a choice that most people would have been too weak or too frightened to make." He paused, looking around at the assembled family, at faces that carried the same features that had characterized Whitmore's for 2 centuries. "The world has changed since then. We have law now that our ancestors didn't have, options they didn't have, resources they couldn't have imagined. But the core truth remains the same. Family comes first. Family comes always. And anyone who threatens this family should remember what happened to the last people who tried." The gathering ended with a prayer at the church that had replaced the original structure, a building that stood on the same ground where Harrison Caldwell had delivered his fatal insult. The congregation sang hymns that their ancestors had sung, prayed prayers that connected them to generations past, and then dispersed to homes scattered throughout the hollow that still bore the Whitmore name. The mountains kept their secrets, as they always had. The abandoned mine shafts, now sealed and forgotten, held their deposits of bone and rotted cloth and rusted metal that had once been weapons. The consortium's families had long since scattered, their descendants unaware of the connection they bore to men who had vanished in the Kentucky wilderness a century before. And the Whitmores continued as they always had, proud and independent and quietly dangerous, a family that had proven once and for all what they were willing to do to protect their own. 27 men rode into Whitmore Hollow on the night of October 14, 1878. None of them were ever seen again, and the only people who know the full truth of what happened to them are the descendants of the people who made them disappear, carrying the secret forward through generations as a reminder and a warning, and a source of dark pride that outsiders could never understand. If this story showed you that some grudges outlast the people who hold them, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next story that nobody else dares to tell. Drop a comment below telling me what you think about the Whitmore's response. Was it justice? Was it murder? Or was it something in between that our modern categories can't quite capture? and share this video with someone who needs to understand that in certain times and places, the line between civilization and savagery was drawn by families who answered to no authority but their own. The Harlan County Mining Consortium learned this lesson too late. 27 men learned it with their lives. And the mountains of Kentucky kept their bones as a testament to what happens when outsiders underestimate the people who call those mountains home. The church where it all began is gone now, burned and never rebuilt. The mine shafts are sealed, their locations known only to Whitmores who will never share them. And somewhere in the darkness beneath the Kentucky hills, 27 skulls grin eternally at the joke they never understood. That all their money and all their guns couldn't save them from people who valued family more than life itself.